Welcome everybody. Again, you are joining today's webinar, Goals, Strategies, and Tactics, Strategic Planning from Vision to Implementation to Evaluation. And we are, this is the second one of our series on the essential elements of effective organizations. So very glad to have you here. I don't know if you all had a chance to join last month's session on board development, but we will be offering monthly series, and I'll come back to what's the next one coming up in December at the end of this presentation. So just to get us really quickly started, you all should see something that looks like this on your screen. You'll see over here on the yellow, or excuse me, the white arrow in the orange box. If you can't see this, this box that's right in front of you, go ahead and click that arrow to open up the control panel. So hopefully everybody is able to hear us okay. If you are able to hear us, go ahead and chat, put a question into the, or let me know via the question or the chat box. I would love to see to make sure that folks are accessing the audio. So go ahead and use the bottom of this, you see the bottom of this box here, questions, chat. That's where you can, at any time throughout today's session, go ahead and pose your questions to us directly. All right, and I see Kate and a few others are coming in, able to hear us. Perfect. You can also, if you have any problem throughout the session on the computer audio, just go ahead and flip onto phone and it'll open up a number for you to call in. So hopefully that technology won't get in the way of our learning here. So my name is Diana Toledo. Again, just to introduce myself, if I haven't had a chance to meet, I know I've seen some familiar names here. I am the Leadership Development Director at River Network based out of Asheville, North Carolina. I've been at River Network for about 12 years, but almost 20 years doing organizational development work, capacity building, which includes a whole lot of consulting around strategic planning. So I do have a few of those under my belt, and I'm happy to share some guidance today about how to approach strategic planning, how to make that process as helpful for your organization as it can be, and share some tips of what we've learned along the way. So I don't know if River Network needs much introduction. All of you are members of River Network, but as you know, we're about a 30-year-old organization. We're just having our birthday here coming up. And over that time, we've filled a unique niche to connect and empower what are now over 6,000 local water-focused nonprofits that are working for clean water and healthy rivers. We structure our work across 4 strategic areas, one of which is supporting leaders in organizations and helping you become as effective as possible. And we also focus across programmatic issue areas, which include drinking water, resilient cities and communities, healthy rivers and agricultural landscapes, and robust and effective water laws. But at the very foundation, we are a capacity building organization. At the bottom, you'll see on our website, we have a water protectors map. You see the link there at the bottom left. That's the map on the top right. Please take a look at who all is in our network. If you are not showing up on that map, I encourage you to fill out the form that's right there and literally put yourself on the map of those 6,000 groups that are doing water work across the US. As a paid member, you have some benefits, and I want to make sure that you're taking advantage of them. Finding funding for your water projects. We're going to be offering a webinar coming up here in the next couple of weeks to show you how to do that through our Business for Water Stewardship program. We offer registrations of River Rally, discounts on equipment, consultations. So down at the bottom, you'll see Carly Schmidt's name and her email. Please, if you have not tapped into some of these resources, make sure you get in touch with her and take full advantage of your membership. So with that, let me turn us right into today's agenda. We're going to talk about the different components of, the foundational components of an organization: mission, vision, values, and how they are the foundation on which your strategic planning is built. We're going to talk about the different phases of the strategic planning process, who is involved, what that looks like, and then we're going to talk about the ever important what happens after the plan. All too often a forgotten piece. Once the plan is written, we see too many plans that aren't getting implemented, so let's focus some time on that. But before I launch right into this agenda, I want to take a minute to hear who all is in the room and what your roles are within your organization. So Caroline, would you please launch that first poll? Just trying to figure out what is your role within your organization. Are you on staff? Are you on the board? Is it something else? You should see a poll come up. Please go ahead and check the right box that describes you for the organization that you're sort of thinking about as you join us today. What is the role that you play? Okay, go ahead and I think the numbers are coming in. There's a couple of folks who haven't voted. Okay, we're going to close it in 3, 2, 1. Great. Okay, so I think all of you can see these results, but you can, if not, let me just read them off. About nearly half of you are the lead staff or executive director. We have about a fifth of you are board members, and the other fifth are program staff, and there's a smattering of some other categories. So great. It's good to see both board members and staff represented here, because this is definitely a shared role to engage in strategic planning across both of those sets of folks. So if you would go ahead and lift up the second poll, Caroline, and we're just curious to see whether or not right now your organization's work is guided by a strategic plan. Do you have a plan in place that's current, that's guiding your work? Okay, let me give it a couple more seconds here. Everybody can get a chance to vote. Okay, so we're going to close it in 3, 2, 1. Go ahead and share those results. 90% of you have a plan. That's wonderful. There's about 10% of you who don't. So let's, I want to make sure that I'm responsive. So let's come back to this question here shortly and see where you are in that planning process. The fact that you joined us here today makes me think that you're trying to figure out maybe when is the time to review it, or maybe there's issues with implementation. So we'll provide some opportunities for you to feed back into that. Okay, so many of you have gone through a strategic planning process. I'm going to push you to, in the questions box, tell us what are, in 5 words or less, describe a previous strategic planning experience. How was it for you personally? How was it for the organization? What would you say about your previous experience strategic planning? How would you describe that? I want to see, so just open up that question chat box and tell us how that's gone for you. Okay, I'm not seeing questions come through. All right, anybody? All right, here we go. It was good. It was informative. That's great. Very little experience in the past. Fair enough. Okay, so a mix of responses here. As somebody who's come into an organization to do strategic planning, I will say that there oftentimes I'm encountering groups that are not overly enthusiastic because they've had at times maybe not the best experiences with strategic planning. So even if you've had a positive experience, or if you've not been satisfied in the past, please know that as you're ready to engage in updating your plan, that it is not uncommon that some members of your team might need some convincing about the value of planning. And so some of that resistance comes from a number of different perspectives. And so here you see where some of that resistance comes in, perhaps, a plan that they've experienced planning that really didn't make any significant difference in the work of the organization, or there's a concern about the time that it's going to take. Whether it's a 1-day retreat, 2-day retreat, some folks just have a real allergy to, sitting around and having strategic conversations over that length of time. And all too often, like you see here, it's organizations start on a planning process that doesn't really ever get to the end. The plan is never finalized, it's never adopted, or if it is, oftentimes it just sits and it doesn't really make a difference. So, if we have uninspiring, experiences, it kind of makes us a little gun shy about going back into it. So if you're finding that within your organization, and I mean staff and board here, that there is some resistance to planning, it's really important to address that front and center rather than plowing right into the planning process, because that will be difficult over the process if you don't have enthusiastic leadership and buy-in from everybody who's participating. Much more likely that you will be one of those organizations that never completes the plan. So understanding, what the process is going to look like and helping members of your team understand what that looks like can help alleviate some of these concerns. Also, being able to share the benefits of how the plan can help your organization. And I'm thinking especially for the 10% that don't have a working plan, or even for the 90% of you here in the room that do have a working plan, reflecting on how that's gone for the organization, or the ways to improve either the process itself or how useful the plan itself is. So part of the reason, we want to think about why do we plan? What's the importance of planning? So I want to just kind of really quickly move through some of this stuff, some of the basics of planning. So, what we've got here is your organizational framework. And so every organization needs to understand who they are, what they're doing, what's the reason why they were put on this earth. And so what that looks like is beginning with the mission. Why do you exist? What is that work look like? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And you're trying to accomplish that in service of a vision. What's this future-oriented declaration of the world you're trying to create through your work? This vision really is the very essence of strategic planning, trying to figure out the most strategic way to build toward that vision. And the last piece of this framework is really the values of the organization. How is it that you approach that work? And you might have organizations that are working towards the same vision, and yet their values differ radically, and so their approaches differ radically. So taking some time on the front end to really define those can be super helpful. So as we dive into, mission and vision, if we can just really quickly differentiate between these two, your mission answers the question of why do you exist? Is it trying to improve water quality of your local stream? Is it trying to enhance the quality of life of the community around you by having them access the clean water and a healthy river? Thinking about the reason, not so much the what you're doing. Thinking about avoiding jargon. This is sort of your first introduction to the larger world. When somebody is exploring your organization, the first thing they're going to ask is, what's your mission? What is it that you're doing? And so making this as compelling and as plain spoken as possible is really key. Your vision, again, is that bigger picture description of the world you're trying to create. It really guides your long-term thinking, and it helps make sure that your mission is on track. And it paints a picture of what, if you're successful at your mission, what is the world that you've helped create? And not just the world in your community and your watershed, but many organizations also fold in a vision language around the kind of organization that they want to become and the role that they want to serve in their community. So this, if you've not taken the time to sort of check back with your mission and vision, and you're thinking of starting strategic planning, ask yourself the question. Take a little time with your board to check with your mission and vision statements to see if they still exemplify and describe the work in the ways that you think of it today. So some examples here, we've got the Nature Conservancy. Their mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. And their big picture vision is to leave a sustainable world for future generations. We've got Oxfam, and if I can turn your attention down to River Networks, our mission is to empower and unite people and communities to protect and restore rivers and other waters that sustain all life. That is why we're here, and we're doing it in service of a vision of a future with clean and ample water for people and nature, where local caretakers are well equipped, effective, and courageous champions for our rivers. So you see how the mission and the vision statements feed into one another and complement one another. And then on to the values piece. Again, you might have organizations that, and oftentimes organizations don't have their values written out or haven't articulated their values. And I know I've worked with organizations that sort of don't want to dedicate the time on the front end, and then we're in the middle of the planning retreat, and we come upon this question of what is our core value of how we do our work, because sometimes in deciding strategy, you need to have clarity on what is really truly important to your organization. So they describe the deeply held beliefs that guide your work. Core tenets, core principles, core values is all sort of language that you see in describing these. And these are unchanging and constant. These reflect the personality, if you will, the culture of your organization. So what you see here is some values that we have done a lot of work on recently at River Network. I was checking some websites in preparation for this webinar, and there's other values about, for example, I was pulling from a statewide river group. We expect government to safeguard water. We hold public agencies accountable. We believe in the power of grassroots action. Some of their values are more tied to how they're doing their work. And so if you have not done work on values, and I will say this a number of times here today, but you would like to get some examples or some tools to help you do that, please let me know. We have a lot of, I neglected to say on the front end here, we have a lot of supporting materials that I could be sharing with you. I'm trying to think about not overwhelming you in a follow-up email with too many handouts and too many forms, but please use the question box to let us know where you would like some additional resources to help you develop some of these pieces. So when we think about the strategic direction of the organization, it really all builds off the mission statement and the vision statement, your values, and then thinking about your strategy. How is it that you want to achieve your vision? Some groups, use litigation as a strategy, public education as a strategy, in promoting civic engagement and getting involved in electoral politics through a 501c4 arm. That's a question of strategy. So the strategy is going to be built on these foundational pieces. And then from the strategy comes what we typically think of as part of the strategic plan, the goals, the outcomes, the strategies and tactics, and how we measure success on those. So let me take a pause here and ask you if you might respond via the question box as you reflect on your mission statement, your vision, your values. Where do you need to focus your effort and your energy now? Thinking all the way through goals, outcomes, strategies, and tactics. As you said in the beginning, 90% of you already have a strategic plan, so this is where you can tell me, where are you in that process, and which of these pieces are you feeling like are priority for you to focus on here in the coming 2-3 months? And that'll help me also guide what kind of follow-up I might send your way in terms of handouts, etc. So take a second to just kind of communicate back. This is one of the challenges of webinars where we can't hear people's voices. All right. Okay, I'm seeing some more. Okay, somebody new to the organization and needs to familiarize themselves with a strategic plan, but my organization could benefit from revisiting and reviewing the mission. Okay. Okay, we have budget to support strategic plan and resource needs. Annual work plans need to focus on annual work plans to support the goals and the outcomes of a 3-year plan. Great, so you're already thinking about the implementation piece here. Anybody else? We have all of these ingredients in place, but they need to be reviewed and strengthened on a regular basis. Absolutely, absolutely. Great. Okay, so a little bit all over. You all seem to be spanning across a lot of these different elements, whether it's more of the ongoing review to needing to review the mission statement. And I will say not every strategic planning process spends a lot of time on the mission statement. It is a question that you should ask yourself, do we need to spend time on this? And if there's a general sense and some of that, an outside facilitator can work with you to, you know, as you interview and get feedback from the board, oftentimes it's in that feedback that it becomes clear that the mission is not altogether clear. And so that there needs to be some time set aside to just build that foundational piece and make sure everybody's on the same page before moving forward with a plan. Okay. So as we define what strategic planning is, you know, you look it up online and there's, you know, millions of hits will come back as you know, look up strategic planning. At its very core, so what I've got here is a definition for you. At its very core, it's a best management practice for both effective board governance and for organizational development. And it's a snapshot in time. I mean, what, excuse me, gotta go back. So it's a snapshot in time. I mean, you are bringing your best thinking at a given point in time about what is the landscape and the external environment look like, what are some of the trends that you need to consider, what are your important stakeholders telling you, where's your niche best found, sort of analyzing who else is doing what in the space in which you're working. So all of this contributes to a strategic plan, but it's your best thinking at the time in which you do the plan, which is why it's really important, and some of you are already starting to, you know, obviously are thinking about this, the ongoing need to adjust and to review your plan and to make sure that the plan is still relevant. So it is foundational. It is the big umbrella under which a lot of other pieces fall into place: the budget, your fundraising plan, annual operating plans for the organization, or annual work plans for particular staff people. All of this should be grounded in your strategic plan. And so what it isn't, though, it is an annual plan. An annual plan is talking about the operational work to implement the strategic plan. It's not usually taking the step back to really analyze your strategy. It is not a business plan or a fundraising plan, although I will talk about a few pieces in which it's to think about how you might embed some pieces of business planning into a strategic plan to make sure that those two worlds of the program and the money aren't kept totally separate as part of strategic planning. And especially is not a rigid, static roadmap. Like I said, it's a snapshot in time. Things change. Today's political landscape is changing rapidly. The resources that agencies have available to them to do the work that you think is important are constrained, ever more. And so with all of those changes, you need to recognize that as that landscape changes, that's why we need to keep checking back in and making sure we're not, this isn't a rigid roadmap for the next 3 years. And typically a 3-year plan is what we're looking at anymore. It's harder to think out like 5 years. Those last 4 years, 4 and 5, become very, very vague. So even within that 3-year time frame, you need to be flexible and keep checking back against it. And it's not a wish list. It is not like, this is where folding in pieces of business planning is helpful, because you want to make sure you're not, it's not a Christmas tree on which you hang everybody's hopes and prayers and enthusiasm for various projects. You need to be really strategic, to make the obvious statement. So why is strategic planning important? There's a whole lot of reasons why. It clarifies mission, vision, and strategic direction, both internally within, the players in the organization, board and staff, and outside to external stakeholders. It forces you to reflect on trends that can impact your organization now and in the future. And that trends piece is super helpful, and one of the big reasons why it is not an annual and operational plan. You're taking time to really reflect on those. It assesses, reassesses, and adjusts the programs to make sure that they work together in a coherent overall strategy. It gives you a framework to help make determinations about, growing, constricting programs, should funding challenges come your way, helps give you a framework for making decisions about how you respond to those challenges. But it also is super helpful in garnering financial support. Any more, foundation officers, it's very common for them to ask for a copy of your strategic plan or to understand how the work you're proposing ties back to your strategic plan. So it can be a super helpful tool for that. And it can be a super positive exercise of building teamwork and building communication across board and staff, and enthusiasm that you're all on the same page moving together in one direction. They do matter. I'm going to share some data here just really quickly. Last time we looked at organizational assessment data for groups that we were working with, what we found is, and this can be helpful if you find team members that are resistant to planning, talk about why they're important. So here we found that organizations that we were working with, and this is over a 3-year time span, so you see initial data and final data in green here. Those that have a strategic plan not only have larger budgets, but experienced increased growth of their budgets over those 3 years. It also helps for reach. You see in terms of participants reached, donors, members, you see the numbers are a lot higher for those groups that have a strategic plan from those who don't. And finally, also for volunteer recruitment, you see this is actually interesting. On the net, you see that groups without a strategic plan have more volunteers because oftentimes what we see is that the groups that lack a strategic plan are smaller capacity, younger organizations that rely a lot more on volunteer labor than they do on staff. And so that's a little bit of what you're seeing here. So, so they do make a difference. And there might be, you might be needing a strategic plan if you, or a revising of your strategic plan. If you find that you fit any of these sort of categories, if you find that you have a menu of programs and projects that aren't working cohesively and one's moving you towards your vision, that might be a good time to plan. If it feels that you've been doing the same work and there's, there hasn't been a lot of changes and it's getting stale, oftentimes that means it's getting harder to raise money for those programs. Strategic plan could be a very helpful exercise. If you find that funders are dictating your work or your board is not engaged, if you just underwent significant leadership changes, oftentimes after a long-time leader leaves and a new leader comes in, to really get the buy-in and help build the vision of that new executive director, it's a great time to engage them in strategic planning so they could put their stamp in the work of the organization and take a chance to review it. And certainly if you're just getting started or you're finding that you cannot say no, which usually leads back up to feeling overwhelmed by too many projects. These are all great reasons why moving into strategic planning is helpful. When is strategic planning not the answer? And as folks who do consulting, we do at River Network, and are called oftentimes to do strategic planning. It is not good when you're facing a financial fiscal crisis and need to move into emergency fundraising mode. That's the time for, the rubber hits the road, you got to get busy addressing that crisis. It's not the time for this sort of introspective exercise that strategic planning really requires. When you really need to build the board, it's a little bit of a balance. If your board is not really engaged, strategic planning can be helpful to get their ideas on the table and get them engaged in the work. But if your board is so far gone down that road of unengaged and you're having trouble meeting quorum, or they're just not, you haven't heard from board members in the last 6 months, which is not all too uncommon, then it's really difficult because you're not going to have enough energy and enough leadership from the board to engage in strategic planning. So those groups that come to us in that situation, we say, let's focus on rebuilding your board, focus your energy on recruitment, on providing opportunities for existing board members to roll off. And once you've got enough leadership there, then let's think about strategic planning. It's also not a way of addressing internal conflicts or a way to create a situation that makes you ripe for letting go of a staff person that you want to let go of. So strategic plans aren't proxy for those sort of interventions that may be needed. So with that, I want to just take a minute here and see if there are any questions. And again, feel free to put questions up at any time, but I want to make sure that I force myself to pause momentarily here. Any questions? Okay, I'm seeing there are a lot of comments that came in after I moved on about people's experience with strategic planning. Some folks incorporated public meetings. That went very well, but it took way too long. Plans that become broad and generalized. So yeah, a real mix of experiences with planning. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and keep us moving, but please just put them in there and I'll keep stopping, slowing myself down here to address them. Okay, so the strategic planning process. Pretty straightforward. What you've got here is the various steps. I broke them out into 6 different steps. and I'll be going through these in more detail here. So plan is starting at the top here, plan to plan. The pre-plan, then actual retreats or planning sessions, drafting, finalizing, adopting a plan, implementation phase, evaluation and review phase. And here there's a little bit of a cycle, the ongoing annual evaluation and review, back to implementation after you tweak programs as needed. And you can stay in that cycle for a while before deciding, hey, we need to, we've sort of outlived the plan, is no longer useful, and so you start back up in the plan to plan cycle. So let me go ahead and start with the plan to plan. What do we mean by that? And so this is those conversations that we get all the time of organizations coming to us asking for a plan. And so the questions that we ask of groups are along the lines of what you see here. Are the leaders invested in planning? Are you committed to taking the time to do it well? Can you put together a planning committee and think about this as you would any other project, right? Who is going to do what? Do we use a consultant? What's the timeline? What's the budget, etc.? So this is all the plan to plan stage. You need the time to do it. At the very fastest I've ever done a strategic plan, and it was all hands on deck, it was a 3-month process. But that did include a whole lot of input from stakeholders, et cetera. But 3 to 6 months is the typical, and a lot of groups, I know it's hard to even fathom doing a 6-month plan, but by the time you get all the way to completing the document and getting it adopted, sometimes you're right there between at least 4 to 5 months for sure. The leadership is critical, both engagement from board and staff. You want to think about the level of input that you want. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the leaders? Whose input do you want to bring into this planning process? So answering that question. Ensuring that you have the resources, which can be the time, the funding, if you want to bring in an outside consultant, and also your readiness to just bring an open mind into the planning process. If a strategic plan is going to require you to make some tough decisions, sometimes it's about letting go of programs that have been dear and near to organizations' hearts. You need to bring an open mind into really doing that analysis of, are these activities serving us as they once did? This is the plan to plan, and so part of that is really thinking through who is going to do what. And so we've got another, Dilbert loves to delve into the world of strategic planning because it's so ripe for this kind of humor. So let you have a chance to take a look at that. Here becomes the consultant. Their most important goal is the ka-ching of bringing money in the door. So everybody has a role and a responsibility, but being very clear on what is the board going to do? What is the executive director's role here? The finance director or CFO, other staff. Are you going to use an outside facilitator, or are you going to facilitate it in-house? Obviously, as a facilitator myself, if you have an external person that can guide you through that, it can be much more helpful to keep you on track and to allow everybody to participate. And so for me, usually the first piece is, can we put together an ad hoc strategic planning team who might include certainly the executive director, maybe some other senior staff, and a mix of the board. That might be folks from your executive committee, but it need not be. In fact, I like to work with an ad hoc committee that includes longtime board members and newer board members. Or if you are grooming somebody to become the next chair of the organization, it's great for them to be part of this ad hoc strategic planning committee. So usually the first meeting of the ad hoc committee is where we outline the process and define the roles for everybody. So if you decide to interview stakeholders, who's going to do the interviews? Who's going to compile that feedback? Who's going to actually facilitate the meetings or write the plan? and be the champion within the board for the plan. All those pieces get outlined just like you would say a water quality monitoring project, right? It's just project management, really. And so you get into the pre-planning phase. And so the pre-planning phase is really thinking about the information that you want to gather here. And so part of that includes, you know, taking time to review your previous plan. How well did you do in meeting the goals that you had laid out for yourself? Did you check against that plan and evaluate it on a regular basis, at least on an annual basis? Was there a process in place to do that? If not, that should help inform how you do things going forward. How effective have your programs been in looking at, and I'll get to the financial information here. So, you know, it involves talking to folks internally and folks externally. The board, the staff, the stakeholders, defining who those stakeholders are, who are the key people that that you want to bring into this. Somebody said here, and I forget who it was, they facilitated 3 community meetings as part of their strategic plan. So that's big, broad input, you know, opening yourself up to the community for them to share what's important to them. You could also narrow that down a little bit and do, you know, surveys of your membership if you have a membership structure. Or I've worked with organizations, most of the plans I do involve some sort of interview process of important stakeholders. So defining who those are. It might be, you know, former board members, a program officer at a foundation that's been a longtime funder of yours, experts on issues that you deal with, whether it's agency staff or public health experts, et cetera, major donors to the organization, sort of laying out, you know, and we have some tools that are helpful to kind of think about categories of stakeholders, and then from there identifying individuals and figuring out what are the questions that you want to ask them. So this is all the sort of gathering of information. It is super important to get more input from outside of your board. We tend to get myopic in organizations. You know, we think we're working on the right things. We think we've got our finger on the pulse, and yet we're only however many board members and staff people. And so getting other input into it really helps identify issues and trends that might be impacting your work now or in the long term. Sharing the perceptions about how effective the organization is and what role it plays within the community, within the basin. Just that external perspective is invaluable in helping inform, you know, what are some key issues that you need to address through your planning. So part of that information, and I said, you know, strategic plans aren't business plans, but there is a piece here about understanding the finances of your organization. So let me move us to this other piece, and part of collecting that information is looking at your finances by program. And so let me ask, what you have in front of you here is just the generic master budget for an organization. If you can see across these columns here, program 1, 2, 3, 4, it breaks out the budget by program area. So you'll have income, and I think I cut off the income header, but you have income, foundation grants, individual contributions, there might be others. So total income by program, and then you have expenses by program, both personnel, project-specific expenses like travel and conferences and contractual help. And then you are allocating operating expenses like your rent, your printer, your copying machine, your supplies. You are allocating those across the different programs, so that what this gives you is a true sense of how each program area is, how sustainable its funding is, and whether or not they are sustaining themselves, or if you are relying on some unrestricted funding to cover those costs. So what you see here is program 1. It's got a net income of nearly $10,000, so you're more than meeting those direct expenses for that program. And program 3 is actually requiring some of that unrestricted money to help sustain it. So getting this big picture of which programs are you having an easier time raising money for? I mean, for some folks, it's instinctive, but having these dollars can be really helpful to, as you project ahead in future years, kind of how you expect these programs to grow or to stay at the level at which they're working now. So let me just ask, how many of you, and you can answer just through the question box, how many of you are currently developing your budgets by program areas? How easily is it for you to answer this question of which program is self-sustaining and which programs require unrestricted funding to help cover their expenses? Let's see if this is something that folks are. I'm going to give you all a chance to answer that question. Are you currently using budgeting by program area? We are not yet. Okay, but we have discussed it. Yes, we do budget this way. Okay, I have a question from Tova about whether to hire a consultant. I'll come back to your question. Yes, we're trying. Okay. And all of our programs are grant funded. So if we don't have a grant, okay, the program doesn't exist. And as you develop more programs, I think this was Tova, as you develop more programs, you'll find that oftentimes programs aren't, you're not able to raise all the grant support for them, but some other programs are able to bring, bring that in then some, right? And so one program could help cover the expenses of another. And it could be a very strategic decision to work that way, to actually invest in a program where you have a negative net income. That might be a very important program that you really, without which you really can't work towards that vision that you laid out. So this is not uncommon, and it is not a bad thing to have programs that are at a deficit. Okay, so what you want to do is bring, and we'll have another, as part of this series of webinars, I think it's in February, we will have a session on financial management. So if you have questions, and I know February is a ways out, but if you have questions about budgeting, that I encourage you to join us at that session, or if you're trying to move to this sort of program by program budgeting, and certainly follow up with me. I'll share my email address again. If you want some budgeting, generic budgeting tools that can help you do this. But once you can develop this picture of program by program, how are they each funded, and are they working at a deficit, you want to bring this thinking of the current year into a forecast tool. And I'll come back to that forecast tool. So I'm going to bring this back here, this one back up for you. Because what you want to think about is over the next 3 or 4 years, you want to pull these numbers forward to get a sense of what, if you expand programs, what are those costs going to do? And can you anticipate and forecast enough income to actually pay for those costs? Because what we don't want to do is develop a wish list of program expansion in our strategic planning process with no thinking at all about whether it's realistic financially to project, to set those goals. So this is a little bit of keeping ourselves in check about what's realistic in terms of, growing or launching new programs or growing existing programs. Okay, let me keep us moving. So back to, okay, so you have now collected a lot of information. And this is why strategic planning processes can go as long as 6 months, because if you're going to interview people, if you're going to do community meetings, it just takes time to really do that. So you've completed that phase. You've talked to staff, probably surveyed your board, you know, and identified stakeholders or community members or organizational members to get input. Now it's time to analyze those findings. And so, you know, this is oftentimes done within that ad hoc planning committee, kind of teeing everything up for the full board at their retreat. So part of what you're doing is confirming mission and vision. Do we need to spend a lot of time here at the retreat, or are we on the same page? Is our mission resonating with the people that we talk to, et cetera? And you are going to, you know, we've all heard of SWOT analysis. There's a few ways to kind of think through and pour over all of that information. You know, the typical SWOT analysis is your strengths, your weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. There's an alternative approach that sort of spins that a little bit on its head and talks about strengths and opportunities, and aspirations and results. So thinking about what are you doing really well? What are some of the assets that you bring to the work in terms of skills, credibility, assets, you know, a history of doing good work, et cetera. So that's what you're, you know, those stakeholders are going to be letting you understand. What are those strengths that you identify internally and that are externally perceived? What are some of the trends and opportunities that present themselves to you? Thinking about the you know, whether it's changes in the political landscape or infusions of investment in, you know, green infrastructure and stormwater management, or if you're in the Great Lakes, you know, restoration, federal restoration funds, or hey, there is, you know, a push for development that is more sustainable. That could be an opportunity to think about how that impacts your work. Your aspirations, thinking about what can the organization be, what is the desired impacts that you're trying to get to, and then your results. You know, what are the tangible, measurable items that are going to tell you whether or not your goals have been achieved? And so you're kind of massaging through all that data to come up with a clear picture of strengths, opportunities, aspirations, results, or threats, if you want to focus it in that negative way. And from those, you identify a set of critical questions that you want to ask, critical issues that you need to really wrestle with in your strategic plan, or prioritize opportunities that are presenting themselves to you that could impact your work, and really thinking about, okay, so what do we do with this? How does our strategic plan, how can it help address these opportunities and prioritize within them, so that then you can develop goals and strategies. So there's a question here, so about the retreat, because this is all leading up to your actual planning session. You know, there's a lot of components to think about here, and this is where team building can be a great outcome of these retreats if they're done well. Somebody asked, how do you decide whether the staff and board can lead the planning on their own, or whether you hire a consultant and facilitator? And I will say oftentimes that's guided by resources. You know, I certainly have seen, and I myself have coached staff in facilitating their own strategic plan when they didn't have resources to help cover, you know, for example, a river network, our subsidized rate, or hire an independent consultant. Plans are more likely to go all the way to getting finalized and approved if you have an external player, or really making sure that you stay on your timetable. It can be possible for staff to do it, but usually strategic planning, when it's led by a staff person, it's just an add-on to everything else they're already responsible for. So though, you know, on principle, there shouldn't make a difference. In reality, what I've observed is that it's just a lot harder for them to stay on top of it, because there's too many other responsibilities that they are delivering for in the organization. Also, an outside facilitator can help a skilled facilitator can help nudge organizations and boards in particular direction, can ask hard questions about, is that really going to get you where you think it's going to get you, and poke at some of your assumptions in a way that it can be harder for somebody who's internal in an organization to do. So, but again, at the end, usually it comes down to resources. But Tova, I can certainly talk more if you want to think through what's the best approach for you guys, or how you might get to being able to hire a facilitator. So this is all the analysis. The ad hoc committee is doing all this work so that they can come in. You're not coming into a retreat with a blank slate, but some of this thinking has already been done, and so you start to present it at that planning session. And so the planning session, a lot of what you're doing is setting priorities. And so what we've got here is a framework to help you determine those priority rankings for program areas or strategic core areas of your work, however you think of them, and help you determine what are some key goals and outcomes for the next 3 years, 3 to 4 years, and then on to think about the funding of those goals. So determining the relative priority of the program areas is key, because as an old colleague used to say, you can't keep all the puppies. We all have programs within our organizations that we love, but sometimes doing the strategic thinking really forces us to ask some hard questions and to make some tough decisions. And so this framework can help you do exactly that. So what you see here is, different priorities, different projects or programs are laid across this framework, where you're looking at the potential impact or importance of that work versus how difficult it is for that work to carry out, or how difficult it is to fund that work. So some of the things you might want to think about in terms of the horizontal axis here is, how well aligned is this particular priority or program with your purpose, your mission, and your vision? How likely is it to have an impact? The duration of the impact, how deep is that impact going to be? How urgent is that problem? What happens if you don't do anything about this issue? Like I would submit coal ash would play that role across at least the Southeast in recent years. Look, it wasn't on anybody's radar for impact and importance until all these folks got to experience what happens when a dam breaches and you get coal ash spilling all over downstream. So suddenly the urgency of the problem became very, very clear. So that got on the radar for a lot of organizations. So those are some of the things you might want to think about in impact and importance on the difficulty and costs. What opportunities exist? Is there new federal or state money on the table that you want to really, take advantage of? How much and how organized is opposition you might meet around that goal? If you're looking at a formidable foe in terms of, say, an advocacy approach on a particular issue, then it becomes quite difficult, right, to get to success on that. And how much effort will it take? How much effort to raise the money? How many people will it take? Do you have that kind of capacity for the volunteers or the leaders to really carry out that project? So as you put each of your project ideas through this method, they're going to land on one of these 4 quadrants. And so, thinking about prioritizing, what you're looking at is right here is your sweet spot, right? It's highly important. It's not difficult to do. This is a no-brainer. This is a high priority program or initiative. The one over here, which is very difficult, costly, and low impact of importance, stay clear from that. And sometimes we see folks who are working in that quadrant simply because they have a very strong and vocal champion on staff or on the board for that particular program. But this is where that critical thinking really needs to come in, and making the case for why maybe that is a low impact, high cost, high difficulty program and one that you should move away from. And then there's the gray area, right? Of, you know, it's important, but it's costly and difficult. Yeah, that's going to be high priority, but you can't fill your plate with too many of those projects or initiatives, because that is going to tax your resources. So again, just a framework. There are others out there, but this one can be super helpful in setting some of those priorities and making some of those decisions. And the other way of thinking about this strategic brainstorming of you know, where should we focus our effort is thinking about, again, opportunities. Where's your niche? What are you doing that is well received and has an impact in the community or in the basin, and that you want to expand that work? Thinking about what are some of those external or internal factors that are getting in the way of you achieving your mission. Think about those within the context of your programmatic initiatives, and what does that tell you about where they should move going forward? Resources, roadblocks, and again, the impact. So these are all questions to be asking of your different initiatives in making some of those strategic decisions about, you know, what happens in the next 3 to 4 years. So with that, I want to take another pause here and see if there's any additional questions. So if you haven't yet done that, if you have any, please type them in now. I'll give it a few seconds here before moving on. Any questions? Has anybody had been challenged by setting priorities, or is any of that resonating in terms of the challenges of letting go of programs that are somebody's favorite? Or have a long history with the organization. Share any experience you might have along those lines. It can be challenging. And yet, if we come up with a strategic plan where you're just doing a lot more of the same, I would propose that maybe it's not as strategic as it could be. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Caroline, if you see any coming in, please jump in. It's hard to set priorities because everything is important. Yeah, hard to discern. Yeah. Whether this is, yeah, it's extremely hard to get rid of programs and come to consensus to do so, whether this is when we do the plan or when we evaluate it. My audio is breaking up. Oh no, I have no idea what, please weigh in if others are having problem with my audio as well. I'm afraid it's probably the internet connection. Okay, others are not seeing that. Okay. Yes, it is extremely challenging. And what I will say is that I have facilitated some challenging strategic planning processes where some real hard decisions needed to be made. And I've seen it work both ways, where organizations found the will to really leave behind programs that they identified just weren't having the payoff for them. And sometimes there are board members or there are champions for those programs that will eventually leave the organization as a result of that. So it does have impact. It is, I want to acknowledge how difficult that can be. I've also worked with organizations that after all the analysis and all of the frameworks, they wanted to hang on to those programs. And so they're still out there doing work that is probably not, it is not the most strategic work they could do, and it's not the best use of their resources. And yet they're so wedded to it that they're just not quite ready to get there. So I encourage you to be courageous in entering strategic planning discussions, as well as open-minded, because it does require courage. Okay, so you've completed the planning retreat and the meetings, and oftentimes, this is an overnight retreat or a day-long retreat. I mean, it's great when you can get people together. to do this and have an overnight and break bread together. It helps tremendously to build that team. But that gets harder and harder for many boards. And so I've also approached planning processes where we break that up into multiple half-day, 2 or 3 half-day sessions, afternoon sessions that don't involve a meal, don't involve a hike or an outing on the water, etc. And so, you definitely lose some, but if that's what it takes to make it fit and get people to think together in person, that's what it is. So once you've completed that, then it's developing the plan. You are coming out of your retreat with some consensus around priorities. And so oftentimes it's, the consultant, if you've got a facilitator, or working with the executive director, sometimes it is that whole ad hoc committee that kind of divvies things up for actually writing the plan. So defining the statements, your goal statements or desired outcomes described. What is it that you're hoping to achieve in the next 3 or 4 years? What are the strategies that you're going to deploy to reach those goals, and the tactics, the specific action steps. Not every plan includes those detailed action steps. Sometimes that comes in at the annual planning level, and that's okay. It's just how you want to structure and thinking through what's the best way to do this for your organization. If you're not doing annual planning, then yes, by all means, fold some tactics into your strategic plan. And so this should be familiar territory for many of you, thinking about SMART goals and strategies: specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound, right? So here you have an example, and I can share a handout with some of these examples of how you might lay out a goal, a strategy, some tactics, and outlining who's responsible, when does this happen, and all very important, how are you going to know that you're successful? What is that measure of success? This is oftentimes where plans fall short, and we don't think about defining that, and so it's a lot harder to evaluate after the fact. So another piece that I want to bring in here is bring your attention back to this sheet. So we had, going into the planning process, thought and reflected on your various programs and how well they are sustaining themselves. And so what you want to do now is really thinking about bringing that analysis that you did on those costs across programs for this year and extend it into the future through forecasting tools. So let me bring your attention to this program 2, right? So program 2 right now has $28,000 in expenses, and it's bringing in about $40,000 in income. So this is a program that is more than sustaining itself. So you start thinking about what is the, your current year here, you have $28,000. You add the indirect cost here. The total cost really for that program is $36,000 when you assign a portion of your fundraising and administrating expenses. And so row 1 here, your work continues. You assume this is where you can set an assumption for inflation, salary increases, etc. So here, for the ease of keeping this very clean, I just assumed a 10% increase. So you see that if the work continues as it is today, your $28,000 in expenses today will be $37,000 in expenses on year 3. And then you start to forecast expenses related to some of the strategic decisions that you're considering. For example, in this case, this organization is looking at adding a part-time program assistant in year 2. And so very part-time assistant, it's $12,000. Also thinking about expanding monitoring into the headwater. Say this is a water quality monitoring program. So what direct expenses might you need? And thinking about if that happens in year 2 again, your total cost will now be $59,000 and $63,000 in year 3. So this is a game. You're playing with all of these different scenarios, thinking about your assumptions about the expenses that are incurred with any strategic decisions about expanding a given program. It helps you project forward. What does that mean for the finances? And so you're coupling this forecast tool with a revenue forecasting tool. So you see here, we had projected revenue first, or the current year revenue was $40,000. You had some major donors that were investing to the tune of 25 grand. You had 15,000 in foundation revenues. And so you're starting to project ahead. What does that mean for next year and for year 2 and for year 3? You want to be realistic. Don't be overly optimistic or pessimistic, right? So what new foundation grants might I bring to support my water quality monitoring program? You can think about, well, we probably aren't going to get any change next year, but if we have time to cultivate, the community foundation, we would want to put in a request or a series of requests and secure $40,000 in this case in foundation revenues in year 2, year 3. If your major donors have made it clear they invested in your monitoring to kick off the program, but it was a 3-year commitment, and that's gonna decrease over the years. This is where you put those numbers in, and you start looking at what are the gaps in projected funding that you will have for this project depending on the different decisions you make of your costs, right? So can you afford to bring in that part-time staff person? Can you afford to expand the monitoring program? And at what point does it make sense to do that? Maybe it's not year 2, maybe it's year 3, maybe you're fine to do it in the first year of your strategic plan. So thinking about the variables that you're considering for your program, you want to use this to look at the ramifications of those decisions. And so once you set up these spreadsheets, basically, you can play with those variables, moving the hire later, making it a full-time, not a part-time position. Is this realistic? And so it's a little bit of bringing business planning into your strategic plan and really making sure you're going into this open-eyed about the repercussions of some of the goals you're laying out for yourself. How realistic are they? Because what we don't want to see is a great, motivating, inspiring strategic plan, and year after year, when you check against it, you're not able to meet those goals because they were unrealistic expectations of where the funding was going to come in for those changes. So with that, I'm just going to pause myself, and again to remind you that in February we will bring this topic back up in much more detail about financial management and give you some tools to help you with these pieces. But certainly reach out if you want to bring in some of these business planning components to your strategic plan, and if I can share any tools, templates, spreadsheets, etc., that could be helpful, or let me know via the chat box. That would be great. So moving right along, I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, keep bringing them in though as they come up, please. So you finalize and adopt the plan, and this feels very easy, but often, gosh, I would love to know how many of the strategic plans that are started in this world, even within the conservation world, are never finalized and adopted. Oftentimes, we don't have the oomph to get to the finish here. But in finalizing it, what you need to, some suggestions. Have other people take a look at it and give you their reaction. You have some of those maybe stakeholders that you interviewed on the front end. This is your tight-knit group of folks who are invested in your organization, but they're not members of the board or on staff. Those could be good to run it through a couple of folks. And ask yourself how realistic is it? Is the political climate, is the financial climate for the organization such that this is something that we can actually accomplish or have realistic goals within that plan. Look, finalize it, get board approval, staff endorsement, and then take time to actually celebrate and share this. And so oftentimes the question of who do we want to share this with is a question that I ask groups on the very front end, so we know what we're aiming for. Is this a document that's going to be just consumed internally in the organization? Or is this a public facing plan? And oftentimes is the executive summary and a pretty version with photos and nice layout that can kind of put some meat on the bones without necessarily sharing all of the details of your plan. Oftentimes that's what we put forth on the website and to hand out to major donors and foundation officers, et cetera. So think about who you want to share, maybe on the front end, so that you're creating the pieces, the collateral, you know, the brochure or the full plan in a nicely laid out way, depending on who are your audiences for that. And then really thinking about, you know, the implementation, because you are not done. This is never done. This is a circle, right? And it goes around and around. So how do we implement annual work plans, fundraising and financial plans, you know, meeting agendas, all of these reports, all of this can be structured to mimic the structure of your strategic plan. If you've outlined core areas or programs, you know, some cross-cutting themes of, you know, equity and inclusion, or, you know, civic engagement, et cetera. However you laid out your plan provides a very good framework to plan your staff annual work plans, to, you know, provide structure to your board discussions, to your reports from staff back to the board, et cetera. So fully integrating that plan into how you operate, operationally, how you function is key to making these living documents. Regular evaluation, whether that is once a year, the board actually pulls it out and the staff reports back on their progress, whether it's, you know, staff retreats, or staff meetings quarterly, perhaps, that like focus on big picture assessment of where are we here. So this is all part of the implementation, and what we've got here in the box is, you know, because time doesn't stop, new opportunities, new ideas for initiatives and projects are coming up all the time. You know, thinking, these are 3 critical questions to respond to those opportunities. Going back to your plan, is it critically important to achieve mission and long range goals? If something's coming up that you haven't already considered as part of your plan, then ask yourself, is it critically important? Is there a unique role you can play that nobody else is playing? And do you have, or can you raise the resources to actually fund the work? Or do we need, if it's important enough, what else falls off the plan? What do we push back to year 2 or year 3 so we can focus on this priority right now? So those are, again, the ongoing checking against your plan to make sure that you don't end up with, you know, just keep adding and adding work to it, which is, you know, sort of by inertia can be what happens. And so the tracking of your progress. If you're not tracking your progress, you really might be kidding yourself about your impact. I love this cartoon. You know, once we stopped putting out complaint forms, then hey, customer satisfaction went way up, right? We can kid ourselves that our programs are a lot more impactful than they are, that the quality of the work is better than it might be because we don't collect the data. So let's not do that. So when you think about it, you know, like I said earlier, a plan is really, no matter how solid the planning process is, it's just a snapshot of your best collective thinking at a given point in time. So you need to constantly evaluate and revisit these opportunities, revisit your strategies. Are the things we are doing getting us the impact we thought they were going to have? You know, are things changing so quickly in the landscape that we need to really revisit this plan? You need an evaluation strategy to be asking and answering those questions. And so, you know, there's a whole lot of work around program evaluation. Funders are more and more inclined to ask, as part of any proposal, you know, how are you evaluating? How are you evaluating success? What metrics are you using, et cetera? So there's, you know, you can put together a data collection plan and an evaluation plan to think about how are you going to collect the data, right? A solid plan identifies the metrics that you're going to be tracking. How are you going to define success? So now here's where you ask, how am I going to get the data to answer that question? surveys, reports, interviews, you know, Google Analytics on the reach of your communications, et cetera, et cetera. Who is going to do the collecting of the data? When and how frequently? You know, we have a pretty thorough evaluation plan at River Network. There are data that we collect after every single webinar, and I'm going to come back to you with this to ask you to fill out the evaluation form. And some data we do once a year. So what is that frequency? Where is that data going to be stored, and how frequently, and who is actually evaluating that data? So we have an internal evaluation team that is in charge of making sure we are collecting, that the tools are up to date, and that we sit down and review that data on a given frequency. So the kind of indicators that you might have, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but some might be more of what I call kind of the bean counting, the activities. How many people did we educate? How many, you know, square feet of rain gardens did we install? How many pounds of trash did we clean up? Other indicator types are around your own capacity, number of staff, you know, the level of board giving, how many volunteer hours you benefited from over the last year, percentage of unrestricted funds. So a lot of that is going to be around the people and the money in your organization. And then the impact indicators. What is the difference that you're making? These are definitely the hardest indicators to capture. Oftentimes it is really difficult just using data alone. And so this is where storytelling and capturing anecdotal information as well can help talk about the impact that you're having. But this is where, you know, is the water quality improved? How many more people are getting on the river as a result of, you know, whether it's promotion, education, or providing river access points, some of the work that you've done. You know, is the enforcement stronger from local agencies? So what is the ultimate impact? And because some of these things take very long to actually show an improvement in water quality. You know, you might be engaging at all kinds of erosion control, you know, putting in BMPs or advocating for better enforcement, but it might take a while for the, you know, the dissolved oxygen levels to actually change, or the turbidity to change. So this is where we can get at some of these proxy and some of these storytellings. So a lot more we can share on that, and I'll send some links in the follow-up email on different indicators to help you in your thinking. And just, you know, communicating that information, you know, dashboards can be helpful tools. If you set yourself some goals for where do we want this indicator to be, you can color code. Are we there? Are we close? Have we completely failed to, you know, meet the benchmark that we laid out for ourselves? So you wouldn't want to create, you know, and the dashboards are a little bit of a hot and sexy topic in nonprofits. So you can go crazy with dashboards. I would say don't dashboard everything. Really think about, you know, whether your audience is your board or your audience is an external audience. What are really some key indicators that you want to communicate out, and focus on that handful of indicators to create dashboards. Otherwise, you could be dashboarding your way into oblivion, and this is not, it is not an insignificant amount of time that it requires to do the collection, to do the analysis, and then to communicate it out. Okay, coming up at the very end here. So plans fail because you didn't get enough input, because they're unrealistic, there's not enough commitment. More so, as the external environment changes ever more rapidly, you know, this is why the industry and planning stopped doing 5-year plans, because you just don't know what's going to happen 3 years from now. And sometimes even a 3-year plan, there could be some significant changes in your community or in your basin that render those plans obsolete before the 3-year time frame. So, you know, this is where the check-in, are the trends changing so fast that we really need to kind of go back to the drawing board. So being responsive and acknowledging or tracking whether those changes are such that you need to do that. Or the plan was never completed. The most common reason why they don't work is because we never get to that end stage. So, you know, I will leave you with this at the very, very simplest, and I just went through a whole lot here, but the plan is going to help you define where you're going, how you're going to get there, and how will you know that you have arrived, that you have been successful, that evaluation piece. And they can be longer or shorter. The process can be, you know, you can go the whole, you know, all the way with, you know, expanding the input that you get, talking to more stakeholders, more community members, or you can keep it a lot closer to the chest. You know, the timeline of planning can expand or constrict, you know, anywhere from 3 to 6 months. At the end of the day, these are the 3 questions that your plan should answer, regardless of how you got to it, though. So with that, boy, I feel like I've just been running a marathon here. Hopefully you've had a chance. If you have any questions, now is the time to post them in here, because I want to also bring your attention to upcoming sessions that we have. So please do type in questions if I can answer any here in the last 10 minutes that we have. But I want to leave this slide up for you to, or 5 minutes we have. Our next, so this webinar is part of a series that I think goes through March and touches on different topics every month. So the next topic is on fundraising, best practices for your organization and fundraising. It's Thursday, December 13th. And we have a couple of other webinars that are open, free and open to anybody, not on organizational development topics, but here they are. Later this month, using gaming and game theory to get to better water management outcomes. And that second one, Thursday the 29th, this is that member benefit of River Network, which is you have access to this Business for Water Stewardship project, through which you can submit project ideas for on the ground work on your river or watershed. And we try to match you with corporations that are putting money on the table to fund those projects. So if you want to hear more about that effort, join us on the 29th, and you can sign up on our website. And again, that's open to our, that is open. The webinar is open to everybody, but access to the Business for Water Stewardship project is open just to dues paying members. So, and again, in February, I think it's February 14th, perhaps, is the financial management webinar that is also part of this series. But there's a couple of others before that in January and February, or in January, excuse me. Okay, I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask you to please complete the evaluation form that's going to pop up as soon as I close this webinar. This is part of our evaluating our success. And so tell us how the session was for you so that we can make the next one better. We take those evaluation results very, very seriously. And again, here is my email. There's my phone number. If there are any aspects that we covered in this webinar that would be that you want more information about, or tools or templates around, this is where you can reach me, or you can email me immediately following this webinar, either tomorrow, Friday, or early next week. I will follow up with everybody with a email that will include the recording to today's session. It will include the slides and some additional resources and templates. So if there's anything in particular you want to see, please come on in here and let me know before end of day tomorrow. So that is what I've got for you. Good luck with your planning efforts, and be in touch if you need any specific help for your own organization's plans. Would love to help you think through it, or support you in any way we can. All right. Thank you, everybody. Oh, my colleague just reminded me, January, we're going to be talking about volunteers. That's the topic for the January session. Thank you, Caroline. Sample plan in table form and a dashboard. Okay, I will make sure to include some of those, Kate, would be glad to, in my follow-up email. Okay, everybody, have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time today to join us for this whole session. Kudos to you for hanging through to the very end. And again, we're here to support your organizations in whatever way we can. So please be in touch, and hopefully we'll see you next month to talk about fundraising. Take great care. Bye-bye.